"Come with me," said the rich rancher, when he saw a poor woman selling her wedding ring for food. Wyoming, late winter of 1889. The wind howled like a wounded animal, threading through the cracks of crooked wooden houses that leaned into the blizzard as if begging for mercy. At the crossroads of Stone Hollow, a weather-beaten trading post stood stubbornly against the storm, its windows fogged from the breath of a handful of patrons inside. Across the frozen dirt path, a young woman emerged from the white blur of wind and snow. Eleanor Brooks, only 24, staggered slightly under the uneven weight of the small bundle tied to her back. Her youngest, Lucy, just 18 months old, her shoulders hunched forward, her faded shawl fluttering like a torn flag. Clutching one of her hands was Tommy, age 7, silent and pale, his lips chapped and blue from the cold. Emma, only 4, held her mother's skirt with reddened fingers, sniffling but too cold to cry. All 3 children bore the same hunger, not just of the stomach, but of safety, of hope. Eleanor's dress, once cream and full, now hung in tattered strips over mismatched boots. Her sleeves had been patched more than fabric could bear. They had walked nearly 15 miles from the last rail station, where the final train of the season had abandoned them to the snow. Inside the trading post, the bell above the door jangled weakly as Eleanor entered. The warmth struck her like a cruel tease. Her eyes found the counter. A single loaf of bread sat under a dusty glass dome. She approached slowly, voice trembling. "How much for the bread?" The shopkeeper, a tight-lipped widow with a sour face, looked her up and down. $1. No haggling. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and spilled the contents of her worn pouch onto the counter. A few rusted coins, a wooden button, an old tarnished hairpin, and one final item, a silver wedding ring, dulled with age and sorrow. The woman behind the counter arched a brow. "You think I run a charity? Or a pawn shop?" A man seated near the stove, his breath reeking of whiskey, chuckled. "Maybe she can trade more than the ring, huh?" Laughter rippled through the room. Tommy's hand tightened in his mother's. Emma whimpered and buried her face in Eleanor's skirt. Eleanor didn't flinch. She placed the ring down with a gentle click, her voice low but steady. "It belonged to a good man. He died for this country. It should mean something." The shopkeeper shrugged, swiped the ring off the counter, and tossed the loaf toward her with a flick of the wrist, as if throwing scraps to a stray. Outside, the wind had not relented. Eleanor knelt on the stoop, broke the bread into 3 meager pieces, and handed them out to her children. She held none for herself. Tommy glanced at the bread, then at the store's window where the ring had disappeared. He handed his share to Emma and whispered, "I can be brave too, like Papa. But please don't sell your coat next, Mama." Eleanor turned away, pressing her lips to his forehead, her tears freezing before they fell. Then came the sound of hooves. A man on horseback appeared from the white curtain of snow, tall, broad-shouldered, with a rifle slung across his saddle and eyes that missed nothing. Samuel Hayes, age 36, had just returned from the southern frontier, owner of one of the largest ranches this side of the state, a man known for being silent, private, and kind. He watched Eleanor shielding her children with trembling arms. Without a word, he dismounted, walked into the store, and dropped 5 gold coins onto the counter. "For the ring, and decency." He wrapped the remaining bread in a clean cloth from his saddlebag and stepped back into the snow. Eleanor stared at him as he handed the bundle to her. "What do you want?" she asked, wary. Samuel looked her in the eye and answered simply, "Come with me." She drew back. "I'm not a beggar. I won't be anyone's pity case." "I'm not offering pity," Samuel said quietly. "I'm offering work, shelter, safety." He placed the food into Tommy's hands and nodded once. "For them." Eleanor's eyes shifted to her children, to the shop behind them, and to the tiny ring that was no longer hers. Her voice was barely a whisper. "What kind of work?" Samuel turned, pulled a thick wool scarf from his saddle, and tossed it to her. "Whatever needs doing. But tonight, just warmth." The morning after the blizzard, The wagon rolled across the frozen prairie, creaking under the weight of 3 half-asleep children and their mother, wrapped in a borrowed woolen scarf. As they crested a hill, the land opened wide below, endless acres dotted with barns, cattle pens, and fences stretching like ribs over the snow-blanketed ground. This was Hayes' ranch. Samuel said nothing as he pulled the reins and brought the wagon to a stop before the main house, a 2-story log home, plain but sturdy, with smoke curling from its chimney. Surrounding it were smaller outbuildings and cabins, barns and sheds. 5 people stood waiting, coats pulled tight. "This is it," Samuel said simply, hopping down and helping Eleanor with the children. They were met with quiet stares. Old Ruth, gray-haired and round as a kettle, stood with a ladle in hand. Beside her, Miguel, lean, dark-eyed, and silent. Jonah, arms like tree trunks from years of swinging hammers. Sarah, tall and sharp-eyed, clutched a broom to her chest. And Caleb, the youngest, no more than 20, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. No one spoke. Samuel gestured to Eleanor. "She and her children will be staying. She'll work for her room and board. That's all you need to know." As they walked toward the house, Sarah leaned toward Caleb and whispered just loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "Guess the boss has a type." Eleanor froze at the porch steps, her voice low, firm. "I can sleep in the shed. We don't need to be trouble." Samuel turned to face her. "My house has rules," he said, "and one of them is this. No one sleeps cold under my roof." He led her and the children inside. The warmth of the hearth hit them like a wave. For the first time in days, Lucy stirred in the sling on Eleanor's back. That evening, after the children had been fed, Samuel returned with a folded piece of paper. "I made this clear." He placed it on the kitchen table, handwritten in steady script. It read, "You cook, clean, homeschool your kids. I provide roof and bread. You owe nothing more. S. Hayes." He handed her a pencil. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then signed, E. Brooks. He turned to Emma, who sat coloring at the table with her tongue between her teeth. "Your mother's working for me. Doesn't mean she's less. Understand?" Emma nodded solemnly. A small smile tugged at her lips. The next day, Eleanor found a folded bundle on the end of her bed, a warm, thick dress with mended sleeves and a note pinned to the collar. "Not mine to give," it read. "Mr. Hayes told me to mend it for someone brave. Ruth." Eleanor pressed the fabric to her face, breathing in its clean scent. But kindness did not keep whispers at bay. In the barn, Caleb tossed a pitchfork aside and muttered to Jonah, loud enough for others to hear. "Guess we're feeding orphans and widows now. Maybe I should start a family too." Samuel passed by just in time. He didn't raise his voice, just stopped in his tracks. "Say that again," he said quietly, "and you'll sleep where coyotes sing." Caleb's smirk died. He turned away without another word. That night, Eleanor stayed up after the children slept. She scrubbed the floor, stacked wood, wiped down windows. She couldn't shake the feeling. This was too much for what she gave. It felt uneven. When she returned to the kitchen, she found a steaming mug sitting alone on the table. Hot cocoa. Samuel, halfway to the door, spoke without turning. "Sleep while you can. Tomorrow is for building, not guilt." Eleanor stared after him, long after he disappeared down the hall. He had not pitied her. He had not praised her. He simply shared the burden, quietly, and without asking anything in return. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor allowed herself to sit, not because she had finished everything, but because she was no longer alone. Spring inched its way into the high plains, but the snow still lingered in the shadows of the fence posts. The wind remained sharp, though less cruel than the one that had driven Eleanor and her children into Stone Hollow weeks ago. By now, the children had begun to settle into the rhythm of ranch life. Tommy, curious and eager, spent his mornings trailing Miguel around the horse pens. The boy clutched a brush half his size, as Miguel taught him the gentle strokes to soothe the restless mare. "Soft hands, muchacho," Miguel said one morning, steadying Tommy's grip. "You treat them like you treat people, with patience." Tommy looked up. "How do you say thank you again?" Miguel smiled. "Gracias." The boy repeated it with care, nodding as if storing the word in a treasure chest inside his mind. Emma, shy and quiet, had taken to sitting cross-legged outside the kitchen steps, her arms wrapped around her knees. She said little, only watching the smoke rise from Ruth's stew pot each day. One afternoon, Ruth opened the kitchen door and called, "Well, come in, or you'll turn into a snow statue." Emma blinked, startled, then stood and followed without a word. From that day, she peeled potatoes at the table, stacked tin plates, and once tried to sing along as Ruth hummed an old Appalachian tune. And baby Lucy, no longer swaddled against Eleanor's back, had her own corner by the hearth. Ruth, who never said it aloud, had knitted a tiny pink scarf for her in the evenings. She draped it gently over Lucy's shoulders one morning with a grunt. "Cole doesn't care how small you are." Outside, Eleanor had turned a patch of porch into a makeshift school. She chalked letters on an old slate board and taught the ranch hands' children to read. Her voice was firm but kind. Tommy excelled, always the first to answer. Emma rarely spoke, but filled the margins of her paper with sketches of flowers, 5 petals, always blue, the kind Eleanor used to tell her grew wild near the hills of Virginia. One afternoon, Samuel stood just inside the barn's doorway, arms crossed, watching from a distance. The breeze carried Eleanor's voice to him, clear and steady. "A man may build a ranch," he murmured, "but a woman builds a future." That evening, Eleanor returned to the porch after putting the children to bed and found something sitting atop her desk. A weathered book. The cover was worn thin, but the pages were clean. Inside the front cover, written in strong, careful hand, "My wife taught from this. She would have liked you." Eleanor stood motionless, then clutched the book to her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She did not cry, not then, but her eyes glistened in the last light of dusk. But not everyone on the ranch welcomed this growing closeness. In the laundry room, Sarah folded a clean sheet with sharp, practiced movements. "He gave her the teacher's table," she whispered to Caleb, who leaned against the doorway. Caleb didn't respond immediately. He stared out the window toward the porch where Eleanor was helping Tommy sound out syllables. Finally, he said quietly, "She's not passing through, she's taking root." Unbeknownst to them, Eleanor had stepped into the hall behind them. She paused as the words reached her, her hand resting on the doorframe. That night, when the children were asleep, Eleanor sat alone in the small room they shared. She didn't light the lamp. Instead, she looked out the window, her face unreadable in the dark. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the ache of not just loss, but of hope. And with it came the fear that she might not belong here, no matter how much her children did. The days grew longer, and spring loosened winter's grip on Stone Hollow. Wild grass poked through the frostbitten soil, and the air smelled faintly of rain and horses. But even as life returned to the land, another kind of chill settled over Eleanor, one not made of wind, but of whispers. It began, innocently enough, in the town square. Ruth, attending the weekly market to barter for flour and soap, stood chatting with 2 other ranch wives beside a sack of dried beans. She spoke without venom, only warmth. 3 children, a pretty widow, and a kind boss. Sounds like a new family to me. The other women raised their brows, one smirked. By sundown, the phrase had traveled through half the county, twisted and bloated along the way. "Samuel Hayes is marrying that widow to keep his land away from his kin." By the next morning, the postmaster's wife was shaking her head knowingly. "She's a clever one, that Eleanor Brooks," caught herself a rancher. And the day after that, a church deacon's daughter declared, "She's already moved in. No ring needed, apparently." The rumors reached Eleanor like a wave of cold water. She heard the whispers in the general store, felt the silence when she entered the tailor's. Even the horses seemed quieter when she passed, as if the whole world had decided she was not quite clean enough for their approval. One morning, she took Emma by the hand and walked into town. Tommy had outgrown his boots. They pinched his toes and left red marks at the ankle. Eleanor had hoped to trade a patch of hand-sewn embroidery for a strip of leather. Inside the fabric shop, the owner, a sharp-chinned woman with a rigid smile, watched them approach. "No ring," the woman said as she measured out the fabric. "But you live on his land?" Eleanor flinched. Emma's small hand tightened in hers. "I do my part," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm sure," the shopkeeper replied, lips thin. Eleanor left without the fabric. Outside, she crouched beside Emma, tucking the girl's coat tighter around her. "Why are they mean, Mama?" Emma asked. "They do not know us," Eleanor whispered, brushing hair from Emma's cheek. "And sometimes, people fear what they do not understand." That night, Eleanor waited until the children were asleep. She moved silently through the room, folding the small pile of belongings they'd brought. A tin cup, a few dresses, Lucy's rag doll. Lucy stirred in her sleep. Emma muttered something incoherent and rolled closer to Tommy. Eleanor tightened the wrap on her baby's shawl, then pulled the old blanket across Emma's shoulders. Her hands trembled. She had nearly finished packing when Tommy stirred. "Mama, are we leaving?" His voice was small. Eleanor couldn't answer. Tommy sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Did we do something bad again?" Eleanor knelt beside him, her voice breaking. "No, sweetheart, never." Downstairs, Samuel heard the creak of the floorboards above. He waited by the cold hearth, a cup of coffee untouched in his hand. When Eleanor came down, bag on her back, Lucy asleep on her chest, she met his eyes. "I will not be the reason your name is dragged through dirt," she said. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He set the cup down. "You leave, they win," he said simply. Eleanor shook her head. "Win what?" He stepped forward. "You staying here, your children laughing, learning, growing, that offends the kind of people who believe survival should only belong to the rich, the ringed, and the ruthless." "And if I stay?" Eleanor asked. "They learn," he said. "Learn what?" Samuel's voice dropped to almost a whisper, that sometimes safety is a choice, not just a place. Eleanor stood there, silent, her heart torn between shame and something she couldn't name, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Upstairs, Tommy whispered through the slats of the floorboards, "Mama?" Eleanor looked up. "We're staying," she said. She untied her shawl, pulled Lucy close, and sat by the cold hearth, where Samuel added a log and struck a match. The fire caught slowly, but it burned steady. The cold returned with sharp teeth that week, biting through every crack in the barn walls and crawling under doorways like a ghost. Winter, it seemed, was not yet done testing them. Ruth was the first to notice something wrong. She stood frozen at the entrance of the storage shed, eyes narrowed at the gaping lock and the scatter of flour across the wooden floor. A half-empty sack leaned awkwardly against a barrel. Several bags were missing: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, and slabs of cured meat. She called Samuel. He arrived without a word, bent low in the snow just outside the door. His eyes followed the footprints, not animal, but human. Clean, heavy steps, familiar boots. "It wasn't coyotes," Samuel said, brushing his glove along the doorframe. "Whoever did this knew where the key was." The rest of the ranch hands stood nearby, watching. Miguel looked up from his post, silent. He had been on night duty. No one accused him, but the air was heavy with the weight of doubt. Miguel met Samuel's eyes. "I was here. I heard nothing." Samuel didn't reply. That evening, tension coiled through the ranch like a rope drawn tight. Eyes lingered longer than they should have. Whispers grew louder in corners. Eleanor noticed Tommy watching Miguel with a mix of uncertainty and worry. But the truth came quickly, and from the smallest witness. Tommy had gone to check on his wooden horse in the shed. He had made it with Samuel months ago, carefully carved and glued, but that afternoon he returned pale. "Mama," he whispered, pulling Eleanor aside. "I saw Caleb. He was in the shed. He had a sack. He saw me, but he didn't say anything. He looked scared." Eleanor's chest tightened. She found Samuel by the woodpile, his sleeves rolled, chopping logs into splinters. When she told him, he didn't stop the axe. His voice was low, steady. You don't take food from children, not even in winter. By nightfall, Samuel confronted Caleb. The young man didn't deny it. His eyes darted to Eleanor, then to Miguel, then away. I thought you were giving her everything, Caleb spat, voice bitter. The land, the house, might as well take the food too. Samuel's voice was calm, almost quiet. So you took from all of us. Caleb looked down. I wasn't going to stay, just needed a head start. You could have asked, Eleanor said, her voice sharper than usual. We would have helped. He didn't answer. By morning, Caleb was gone, a blanket and canteen tied to his saddle. No one stopped him. But what lingered wasn't anger. It was disappointment, especially in Tommy. That night, he sat by the fire, shoulders hunched. He said he was family, Tommy said. Why did he lie, Mama? Eleanor brushed his hair back, heart aching. Sometimes people forget who they are when they're scared. But I wasn't scared, Tommy said, chin trembling. I told the truth. I know, she whispered, and I'm proud of you. After the children slept, Eleanor sat by the hearth alone. The flames danced gently, but her mind burned. This place had given her hope. It had also tested it. At dawn, she pinned a small paper beside the fireplace. Written in her hand, simple and firm. We share, we tell the truth, and we protect the smallest among us. Ruth saw it first and nodded. Miguel came after, hammering a nail through the top edge so it would not fall. Later, Jonah read it aloud for Sarah, who stood silently, eyes unreadable. By sunset, no one had torn it down. That evening, as the sky turned bruised with dusk, Samuel found Eleanor by the fence line, watching the snow melt slowly along the edges of the pasture. He stood beside her a moment, then said softly, I should have seen it coming. You trusted this place. I should have made sure it was worthy of that trust. Eleanor looked ahead, voice steady. We build trust, she said, same way we build a ranch, nail by nail, storm by storm. Samuel nodded. Behind them, the house stood quiet but firm, a little bruised by betrayal, yet still warm inside. The first warm winds of spring brought not just blooming ground but new faces across the range. One of them was Mr. Halpern, a tall, sharp-dressed man from Missouri, owner of several estates, and known for scouting talent as quickly as he dismissed it. He arrived at Hayes Ranch on business with Samuel, but his eyes lingered elsewhere, on the woman in the blue calico dress, sleeves rolled, her youngest on her hip, while directing children at a makeshift chalkboard near the barn. After observing Eleanor teach for just 15 minutes, he approached her directly, tipping his hat. You've got the tone of a teacher and the spine of a soldier, he said. I could use that. She looked up, wiping chalk from her hands. I used to teach, she replied quietly. Before the war. Before everything. That's what I figured, Halpern said, smiling slightly. I need a woman of sense to oversee my estate school. My tenants' kids need learning, but I want someone who can command a room. You'd be well paid. Your children would want for nothing. Warm beds, proper clothes, a future. His words were honey-coated, and yet Eleanor felt the weight beneath them. Samuel overheard the offer, though he said nothing. His eyes, however, followed Eleanor a little longer that evening. The others assumed she'd go. Ruth offered a congratulatory nod at supper. Sarah didn't speak at all. Even Miguel, who rarely commented on domestic affairs, muttered, Wouldn't blame her. It's a fine offer. Eleanor didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, she found Ruth slicing bread early, the old woman's hands steady as always. You think I should go? Eleanor asked. Ruth didn't answer immediately. Then she said, Sometimes, roots are worth more than ladders. Eleanor mulled those words all day. Later, Tommy, who had overheard the offer, brought her something bundled in cloth, his wooden toy horse, carefully wrapped in a scrap of old shirt. If we have to go, he said softly, I want to leave this with Mr. Hayes. He fixed it once when I broke it. like he fixes us, every day." Eleanor knelt, heart cracking. That afternoon, she walked to the corral, where Halpern was inspecting a new colt. He turned, confident. "I trust you've decided," he said. She nodded. "I came here with nothing," she began. "Less than nothing, but I found something more than bread. I found honor. My children are growing with it." Halpern's expression cooled. "Honor feeds no one, Miss Brooks." Eleanor's voice didn't shake. "Neither does shame." She turned before he could reply, her boots crunching dry earth underfoot, as she walked back to the house that wasn't hers, and yet had given her more shelter than she ever knew to ask for. Later that evening, Samuel found her seated on the porch steps, Lucy asleep in her lap, her arms wrapped gently around the child's warmth. "You told him no," he said. "I did." He didn't ask why. He simply handed her a small tin mug filled with warm cider and sat beside her. Above them, the sky stretched quiet and wide, like the kind of peace only earned after war, and for the first time, Eleanor didn't feel like she was merely surviving. She felt like she had chosen something, not just turned something down. She had chosen to stay. The storm came fast, faster than the skies had warned. One moment, the ranch was humming with early spring chores. The next, dark clouds barreled over the hills, and the wind turned feral. It ripped shingles from the barn roof, snapped fence posts like twigs, and sent livestock bolting in all directions. Eleanor clutched Lucy close as Samuel and the ranch hands scrambled. Miguel shouted something over the wind. Jonah ran with ropes. Caleb tried to corral horses while his hat flew off. Samuel barely ducked a falling beam before shoving the stable door shut. Somewhere in the chaos, Emma tripped and scraped her knee. The little girl cried out, blood and mud mixing. Ruth swept in to lift her just as Eleanor got to her, heart pounding. By dusk, the wind had calmed but left devastation in its wake. Rainwater dripped through broken shingles, wet blankets steamed near the fireplace. Lucy, shivering from exposure, began to burn with fever. The ranch had lost order, but no lives. That night, nobody slept. Jonah kept the remaining fence upright with spare posts and rope. Miguel took first watch outside. Ruth and Sarah worked beside Eleanor in the kitchen, boiling broth, wringing out cloths, placing wet shoes near the fire. Eleanor never stopped moving, fetching water, washing wounds, tending Lucy, and checking on Emma, who whimpered through fevered dreams. Samuel returned near midnight, blood caking a bandaged gash on his arm. "You should rest," Eleanor said, eyes rimmed red from worry. "I will," he said, but didn't. He sat outside with the shotgun across his lap, eyes scanning the quiet fields. Hours passed. And then, a lull, silence heavier than the storm. Eleanor, exhausted but alert, saw Lucy finally doze. She stood and went to the corner, rummaged for Ruth's old guitar. She hadn't touched an instrument since her husband died, but her fingers remembered. She sat near the fire, cradled the instrument, and began to sing. A lullaby from Carolina, the one her mother sang when nights felt too long and the war too close. Her voice was rough at first, dry from the wind, but soon it settled, low and soft, like the hush after snowfall. The flames danced, the strings hummed. Outside the doorway, Samuel sat still, his hand resting over his wounded arm. He said nothing, but the firelight flickered across his face. And he was not watching the night. He was listening, and he was watching her. No one interrupted. Even Caleb stayed quiet. The song ended with no applause, just the creak of wood and the distant lowing of cattle finding their way back. By morning, the damage was plain, but so was the survival. The barn roof was half gone. One side of the fencing lay flat. Water had seeped into sacks of flour. Tools had gone missing in the mud. Samuel gathered them all near the porch. Ruth held Emma. Miguel leaned on a shovel. Jonah limped slightly, and even Sarah came forward, dirt on her apron. Samuel's voice was rough. "We lost wood," he said. "We lost fences, but we never lost each other. That's why we'll rebuild." No one spoke, but every head nodded. Then Samuel turned to Eleanor. "I built this place for one life," he said, "but I will rebuild it for many." His words were not dressed in romance, but they were a declaration. And Eleanor, standing with Lucy on her hip, Emma beside her, and Tommy holding her hand, felt something she had not in a long time. She felt home. Summer arrived quietly in Stone Hollow. The barn roof had been repaired. The pastures were green again, and the air no longer smelled of wet earth but fresh hay and wood smoke. Samuel Hayes's ranch, once scarred by wind and storm, now held a quiet rhythm of recovery. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Samuel gathered everyone for supper beneath the awning near the house. Eleanor and Ruth had been cooking all afternoon, stew rich with wild herbs, fresh cornbread, sweet jam from the last of the preserved berries. Emma had insisted on stirring the cornmeal, flour dusting her nose. Tommy helped set the tables. Lucy toddled barefoot through the kitchen, her pink knitted scarf dragging behind her. The long wooden table was lit by lanterns and the soft orange of the setting sun. Plates clinked, laughter hummed low, and the smell of bread filled the air. In the middle of the table sat 4 new wooden cups. Samuel had carved them himself, each polished smooth, initials carefully etched by hand: Tommy, Emma, Lucy, and the 4th simply marked E. Eleanor touched it gently, her thumb tracing the curve of the letter. After the meal, as dusk deepened into velvet blue, the others drifted off one by one: Miguel, to check on the stables; Ruth, to lay Lucy down in her cradle; Jonah and Sarah to finish the dishes. Only Samuel and Eleanor remained. He led her to the porch, quiet steps echoing on the wood. They stood side by side, arms nearly touching but not quite. "There is no paper," Samuel said, his voice low. "No preacher. Just a porch, a place, and a man who wants you to stay." Eleanor looked down at her hand, bare, the silver ring long gone, but she didn't reach for it anymore. She looked at the man beside her, sleeves rolled, calloused hands, eyes that didn't promise the moon, but always delivered warmth in winter. "Then let me stay," she said, her voice steady, "not because I must, but because I want to build this, nail by nail, with you." Samuel said nothing, but his hand found hers, fingers closing around it slowly, as if anchoring something deep and unseen. Inside, Ruth gently rocked Lucy, now asleep. Emma sat by the hearth, drawing a picture of the ranch house, crooked but full of light. Tommy stood at the front of the porch, holding a small wooden sign he'd worked on all afternoon. He turned to them. "Can I hang it now?" Samuel nodded. Tommy stepped forward and nailed it carefully beside the door. One word, etched in big, uneven letters: home. No church bells rang, no rice was thrown, there were no bouquets or speeches. But there, under a Wyoming sky, a family stood, not named by law, but by choice. And that was enough. If this story touched your heart, from a widow's quiet courage to a rancher's silent strength, don't forget to show some love. Hit that hype button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable tales of grit, grace, and love blooming where you'd least expect it. We've got more stories coming your way. Stories where the wind howls, the fire glows, and hearts find home. Until next time, partner, keep writing for love.